Hello, my name is Dr. Appel from Ado Psychology Center, where we specialize in treating anxiety, depression, and OCD. Welcome to our video seminar series. Hope you enjoy this video. This video is on taboo OCD subtypes. Taboo is in quotations because they're not really taboo when you truly understand OCD, but they could seem that way. And so let's get into the details of the specific subtype. So the goals for this video are to gain familiarity with these subtypes and to learn about treatment. Very briefly, the OCD cycle, which I discussed in more length in the general OCD seminar, but as it relates to taboo OCD subtypes, there's some kind of trigger in the environment. It might be passing by a playground, and then the person starts having obsessions. Oh my God, what if I'm a pedophile? Or it might be being in the kitchen, seeing a knife and saying, oh my God, what if I took this knife and stabbed someone? So that's how this cycle begins with this specific subtype. And that obviously causes distress, and the person engages in compulsions such as hiding all the knives or running away from the playground area, which provides temporary relief, but not long-term relief. So let's see some specific examples. So let's see some taboo OCD examples. So you can see over here on the left side, by this blue square, some more of the typical subtypes that we've spoken about in other videos. And there's also the more taboo types, so violence and aggression, sexual taboos, religious or blasphemous obsessions, and OCD suicidal thoughts, which are different than regular suicidal thoughts. I'll get into each of these in more detail in the next few slides. The reason I put these all together in one slide is to show you how just as contamination OCD is OCD, so too is like religious OCD or violence or aggression or sexual taboos. All of these subtypes are the same, are just different flavors of the same OCD disorder and should be treated as such, as I'll explain in the next couple of slides. So let's start with this one over here, violence and aggression types of OCD. So a very common one is, what if I am going to punch someone in the face? What if my neighbor, like every time I see my neighbor, I remember something that they did a while ago and I'm afraid, what if I punch them in the face? So as with all these subtypes, with all these subtypes within the taboo category, the person is not actually interested in punching anyone. They are just afraid of the possibility that they might. Another example is fear of stabbing a loved one. I actually had a client who was afraid that he was going to stab his child. And he never, wanted to, but he was very, very afraid of it. And this is another common one where people, are afraid that whether they're using a knife in the kitchen and they may like lose it and just stab someone, or if they get angry at someone, they're afraid they might stab someone. And again, this is not a rational fear. This is just an irrational fear of like, what if? And how could I prove to myself that I for sure won't? And maybe I need to hide all the knives in the kitchen to make sure that I don't. That's what we're talking about here. Another example, especially in New York City, is fear of pushing a stranger in front of a train. So again, it's the fear of it. It's like, what if it could be an accidental type fear? Like, what if I accidentally knock someone into the tracks? But that's more of like a harm OCD. This type, which is more aggression or violence, is what if I have the urge to push someone in front of the train right before the train enters the station? And the person's so afraid of it, they tend to maybe, walk away from where people are standing or walk only in the center of the subway station to make sure that they won't lose themselves and push someone in front of a train. But again, it's an irrational fear. Sexual taboos, there are a few examples that go into this category, such as intrusive images. So having sexually graphic images that are intrusive and non-enjoyable. The person's not purposely trying to bring them up. They're just kind of entering their mind. And as with many OCD subtypes, the more you don't want to think about something, or the more you don't want to have a certain image, and the more you try blocking it, the more likely it's going to come. And so if someone's so afraid of having these intrusive images, they might just keep coming, and then every time it comes, they get a little triggered and they don't want, and they're waiting for the next time it happens, and then they just keep coming again and again. Another example is incestuous obsession. So what if I want to engage in a sexual relationship with a family member of mine? And again, it's not that there's any true desire there. It's the fear of the what if. Is it possible that I might one day? And so someone that does have this fear will always like leave the room whenever that family member comes into the room. Not because it's not because they're likely to engage in such a relationship with them, but it's because they are so afraid that they have to do everything they can to prevent it. Another example Another example here that doesn't necessarily fall into the sexual category so much, but sexual orientation obsession. So someone who identifies as heterosexual is deathly afraid that what if I am homosexual, or vice versa. Someone that identifies as homosexual is deathly afraid, like maybe I'm not actually that, I'm really heterosexual. And so these are examples again where the person is not genuinely exploring or genuinely unsure or fluid or any of that. It's really just that they identify a certain way, and when they're not triggered, they can tell you, no, I'm straight, or no, I'm gay. But they are so afraid of the what if that they then start avoiding people. If they are straight and they're afraid they might be gay, they start avoiding people of the same sex. If they are gay and they're afraid that they might be straight, they avoid people of the opposite sex, or they keep checking. So we'll talk more about compulsions that go along with all these obsessions, but this is another very common one. In terms of another one here, violent or aggressive sexual thoughts. So what if I engaged, or what if I will engage in a violent or aggressive, sexual act without me being able to control myself, or something of that nature. So it's very similar to like, what if I stab someone? What if I hurt someone this way? What if I hurt someone that way? It's just another one of these categories. Another example is pedophilic thoughts, like I mentioned before. What if I'm a pedophile? And people may not want to play with their own kids or change their own kids' diapers, or walk, they would cross the street if there's a kid walking on the same side of the street as them. And again, there's no actual desire here. It's just the constant fear of what if, and how to know for sure I'm not. And then we have other taboo topics, such as religious or blasphemous thoughts. So maybe the thought of, I hate God, or God is bad, or it might be intrusive images related to God that are inappropriate. And so, once again, here the person is not interested in having these thoughts. They don't really feel that way. They're just afraid, like, what if I actually hate God? Or what if, or they have these intrusive images relating to God that are considered inappropriate, and they just want to stop them. So could be another category that falls into the taboo subtype. Suicidal thoughts is another one where someone, um, is afraid from an OCD perspective that they might commit suicide, or they might act on some urges. So it's not that they are actually suicidal or have thoughts of committing suicide. They're just so afraid of what if. And I've had a few patients like this who, when it was most severe, they would take a leave of absence from school even because they were afraid if they were left in a room alone, how can they know for sure that they won't jump out the window? What's a bit more complicated with suicidal thoughts is that sometimes there is some genuine suicidal ideation going on. So some thoughts about suicide. Maybe the person's depressed, has some thoughts of like, what's the point of life? I wish I just didn't wake up in the morning. They don't have any active suicidal thoughts. They don't have any plan. They don't have any thoughts of how they might commit suicide. But even just the thought of like, I wish I didn't wake up tomorrow, from an OCD perspective, could then turn into something like, this means that I might go ahead and commit suicide, and now I'm not safe and I have to be protected. This is a little more of a complicated one because when it comes to suicide, we take things very seriously. We try preventing that. at all costs. And so you need to draw a fine line without feeding into the OCD, but still making sure that you are dealing with whatever actual risk is there in an appropriate way. That's why for this one specifically, it'll be super important to work on this one with an OCD specialist. So are these types actually rare, this taboo category, or are they just not discussed as much because people may be embarrassed of them? So if you look at the actual prevalence rates, this was a study done by Pinto, who's at Zurcher Hillside Hospital, and he looked at 293 adults with a primary OCD diagnosis and found that when asking them about the symptom category of their obsessions, if you look here, contamination obsessions are about 57% of them endorsed, and aggressive obsessions, the top ones, about 45%. So right around the 50% mark, not too far from contamination obsessions. And contamination is probably like the most common category, and yet aggressive obsessions are really close to it. So I would say that actually these taboo subtypes are much more prevalent than we realize. It's just that it's not discussed as much because people are often embarrassed to speak about them, which is why it's so important as an OCD therapist to ask questions and not just assume that the client is going to reveal this type of information on their own. It's also important to create a therapeutic environment where the client will feel safe to disclose this. It's important to ask very directly. Like, it's very common for people with OCD to have thoughts that, may be embarrassing in some way until people understand that it's OCD, related to stabbing someone, hurting someone, sexual thoughts, etc., and ask them if they endorse any of that. So this is a study that I did, asking a group of individuals who don't have OCD to read a short story about these different subtypes. And as you can see, contamination and symmetry OCD were identified by 60 or 70% of the people I studied, whereas when they read stories about a case of sexual OCD or aggression OCD, almost close to 0% were able to identify it as OCD. So in the general population, people have a very difficult time recognizing these subtypes as OCD, which again leads to more of the stigma and more reason why people with OCD would be reluctant to share it. When it comes to perceived dangerousness, once again, you can see how the aggression and sexual subtypes people felt were super dangerous, whereas when it came to contamination and symmetry, they did not feel it was very dangerous. But in reality, they are all equally as dangerous or not as dangerous, because when a person has aggressive or sexual OCD, it's not that they are more likely to engage in it. If anything, they are less likely to engage in it because you're so afraid, like, what if I did? How do I know for sure? What if, like, I need to hide all the knives? That's the last person who's actually going to stab someone. And yet, when it comes to people's perceptions, people think that such people, they definitely seem more dangerous. I also did a study where I looked at the percentage of news articles covering different topics. So we looked at the first 120 articles on Google for OCD when searching for OCD. And as you can see here, some articles were just generic about OCD, but a lot of them were about contamination, even harm OCD. Now, harm OCD is where people are afraid they might accidentally have hit someone with their car, for example, or that they might accidentally burn a house down by not checking the stove. So it's different than the aggression subtype. But when you look at the sexual and aggression subtypes, you see that it's a much smaller percentage of articles that cover those topics. So once again, this explains why it's so unspoken of, why it's so it goes unrecognized, even though, as we saw before, the prevalence rates for these are not that much lower than more typical, what people would consider typical OCD subtypes. Which brings us to a sad statistic, which is amongst physicians, and physicians are often the first line of contact for someone with OCD. As you can see here, in a study done by Glazer and others in 2015, 80% of them misidentify. They were not able to identify aggressive OCD, like aggressive subtype of OCD, as OCD. And pedophilia was at 70%, Homosexuality was at 84%. So you see these subtypes that people are not as aware of, even physicians had a very difficult time being able to identify them as OCD. Even more concerning is among APA members, American Psychological Association members, some mental health professionals. Also, as you can see, when it comes to contamination obsessions, only 15% were not able to identify it as OCD. But when it came to aggressive obsessions or homosexuality obsessions or sexual obsessions about children, the numbers are much higher for misidentification, 77%, 40%, and these are therapists who are not necessarily identifying these subtypes for OCD. So when it comes to OCD, I really do think it's one of those disorders where a specialist is really important. Whereas a specialist for any disorder would be helpful, I think it's especially true for OCD, for sure when you're talking about these type of subtypes that other people are less familiar with. In one of my studies, we found that if we were to educate the public and explain to them more about OCD and what it is and how it can affect different subtypes, you can see here how the groups that got the education, the experimental groups, increased. So increased their rate of recognition. So for example, 0% of people were able to recognize the aggression OCD subtype as OCD, but after the education, they were able, like 60% of them were able to recognize it. The sexual one had a much harder time, and maybe that's some extra taboos we have in society related to that domain. But you can see our education definitely helps. So it's good to educate ourselves, educate the public, educate therapists, educate doctors, and that's part of my goals with these video seminars is to disseminate this information, not disinformation, so that people can be more aware and hopefully identify OCD earlier on and get treatment instead of suffering in silence. So let's now differentiate. How do we differentiate OCD versus actual aggression or actual pedophilia? Because I feel like that's a really important distinction to make. So when it comes to making this distinction, one thing we want to look at is history of actual behavior. Has this person actually ever stabbed someone before or punched someone before? Or have they actually ever engaged in any type of pedophilia behavior before? So that's a very good indicator, if it's not OCD. Another one is actual pleasure. Is there any pleasure they're getting from, let's say, being in a schoolyard and seeing children around? Or is there part of them that enjoys the fact that they could stab someone and hurt them? With regards to the, suicidal taboo subtype, um, do they actually have any suicidal thoughts? Have they actually engaged in any suicidal attempts in their history? But oftentimes it's complicated, as I mentioned before, because sometimes people do have some level of suicidal thoughts, but then OCD hijacks that and turns it into something that the person fears is a much higher level, much scarier level of OCD. So maybe the person just has thoughts of like, I wish I didn't wake up tomorrow because life sucks. But OCD tells them like, okay, if you had this thought, you might actually jump out a window. You should go home and make sure you're safe. And then they're constantly afraid, what if I commit suicide? Um, Similarly, someone might have a history of actually punching someone in the face once, but that doesn't mean that now that they're having these intrusive, unwanted, distressing thoughts about stabbing someone, that they're more likely to do it. So it could become complicated. The picture is not as rosy as it seems, where it's either they have like no thoughts at all, like no genuine interest at all, or they have like full genuine interest. Sometimes it is a complicated mix, and you have to know how to tease that apart. Because you want to make sure you're assessing for risk and dealing with the risk at the appropriate level, but you also don't want to feed into the OCD and say, okay, let's just be extra careful here and here and here. And then you're really feeding into the OCD where the person like, okay, my own therapist is a little bit worried about me. I definitely need to worry. And then you just exacerbate it. So let's talk a little bit about treatment. When it comes to treatment, I would say there are three components. First is psychoeducation. So giving more information about these taboo OCD subtypes and how it's just OCD and how it's different than actual, interest in harming people or pedophilia or all that. You want to normalize it and say like we all have intrusive thoughts from time to time. and we all have sometimes what culture would consider inappropriate thoughts. But you also don't want to provide reassurance, because if every time they tell you about a thought they have, you then reassure them that it's just OCD, that could turn into a compulsion where now they need to keep telling you and keep getting reassurance from you that it's just OCD. So it's really more of like a one-time conversation you have, not an ongoing conversation. Exposure and response prevention, of course. And again, if you want to learn more about this, we're going to apply it here to these cases, but if you want more broadly, look at my video on general OCD. And acceptance of healthy aggression, which is a psychodynamic idea. And I think it really applies to this specific taboo subtype of OCD, which is similar to the idea of normalizing, but having a thought that you want to punch your neighbor in the face when you're having like a really stressful day and they're being annoying. It's called healthy aggression. Like, we're humans, we're gonna have that type of thought, and it's healthy. It lets us like release some steam, having this like thought, like, okay, I'll just punch them in the face, and that's okay. It's when we become intolerant of healthy aggression, and we say, no, that's terrible. Now I'm a bad person. Now I'm immoral. Now I might actually punch them in the face. That's when it becomes an issue. So acceptance of healthy aggression is really important. So let's talk about some specific exposure examples for taboo OCD subtypes. So for violence or aggression, you might have someone carry a knife with them in their backpack. Again, you always want to make sure that you're assessing for actual, risk, and make sure that it's legal and all that type of stuff. But within reason, that could be an exposure. Or using a knife in the kitchen to cut vegetables when their family's around, if they're afraid that they might stab them, as an OCD fear, not a genuine fear. Train standing, near other people by a platform and thinking how technically you could push them in. Sexual taboos of purposely thinking of explicit images, so that eventually the goal here is where you don't really care about it as much. When you stop running away from it and you confront it, again, you want to be within reason, you want to be within the person's values. If the person's religious, you want to consult a religious figure, but that would be an example. Suicidal OCD thoughts, so you can have someone read articles related to suicide and think how technically it could be them that they're reading about. They could spend time on the roofs of buildings. Again, you always want to assess for actual risk, but we're talking about cases that's clear OCD, suicidal thoughts, not actual suicidal thoughts. And again, I don't recommend anyone doing this on their own, because that's where a specialist can help you tease those apart. Religious or blasphemous exposures, probably best to consult a religious figure. Also, you have to understand the person's religious context and culture. And I did a video specifically for religious OCD among Orthodox Jews, where I go into a lot of detail. So if you're interested in that specific category, feel free to check out that video. Pedophilic OCD, so sitting in a park where kids are, playing with your own kids, nieces and nephews. And as I keep mentioning throughout, you always want to work with an OCD specialist when it comes especially to this taboo category of OCD, to confirm the diagnosis of OCD and to make sure that the exposures are appropriate for you. So to summarize, taboo OCD themes are neither more dangerous nor more rare than better known OCD subtypes. Treatment for taboo themes relies on the same underlying mechanisms of exposure and response prevention for other OCD subtypes. But when it comes to this subtype specifically, working with an OCD professional to confirm diagnosis and to help you create exposures is the way to go. Hope you enjoyed this video seminar. To see a full list of our current videos as well as upcoming videos that we'll be posting soon, visit us at adopsychologycenter.com and sign up to be notified when we post new videos. Bye for now.